This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I take a look at the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst 7-mana cards in Magic. This will actually complete a series of MTG Top 10s that look at mana values, as I've already done 1 through 6, 8 and 9, and a high mana one for 10 mana or higher. So this will be the last worst list about a mana value for quite some time. Anyway, if you're paying 7 mana for something, you're starting to approach the place where you should expect to be able to win the game with whatever it is you're spending all that mana on. Or at least shift the game drastically in your favor. But of course, not all 7 mana cards do that, otherwise this list would be really hard to make. As usual, for a card to be on a worst list, it has to be bad in Magic's 3 main play modes: 60 card constructed formats, limited, and EDH. The card also has to have been bad for its entire history. Cards that were playable in their original context but don't seem very good today just can't be here. In short, a card has to be bad everywhere and throughout all of Magic's history, or it can't really be considered one of the worst Magic cards ever. There are 699 7-mana cards in Magic, and in this video I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst of the bunch. At number 10, it is Bronze Horse, a 7-mana 4/4 with Trample. If you control another creature, all damage that would be dealt to Bronze Horse by spells that target it is prevented. So, a 7-mana 4/4 Trampler is just an awful rate, and it always has been. This does come with some additional upside, but it's so minimal that it just doesn't do enough to make this card anywhere close to playable. Sure, it can't get taken down by damaging removal spells, but there are 2 important limitations on that ability. First, you have to control another creature, or the ability just isn't active. Second, it only prevents damage done by targeted spells, so sweepers that do damage can still take it down. Of course, the fact it's an artifact creature also means there's lots of cards that say destroy target artifact that can kill it too. Of course, your opponent probably isn't going to be that concerned about removing this anyway, as any spell they are spending 7 mana on is going to completely blow this out of the water. At number 9, it is Mold Demon. This has much better stats than Bronze Horse does. It's a 7-mana 6/6, which looks really impressive after Bronze Horse, but Mold Demon's text box is entirely downside. When it enters the battlefield, you have to give up 2 of your swamps. That's a significant enough downside that you don't really have a reason to play this. Sure, some decks like sacrificing lands, but there are dozens of cards that actually have a good effect beyond helping you sacrifice lands, and this doesn't get close to meeting that threshold. At number 8, it is Jedit Ojanen. This is kind of a stand-in for all of the vanilla 7-mana legends from Legends, and there are several of them. Jedit Ojanen is just the worst of the bunch. They all offer below-rate stats and, like all vanilla creatures, have no other effects. The design of these cards is always very much baffling to me, even if it was very early in Magic's history. You see, Legends is one of the most groundbreaking sets in the history of Magic. It introduced both multicolored cards and legendary permanents, 2 things that are a massive part of the game we play today. If you want to hear me go deeper on how important Legends is, I did do a top 10 on the most important Magic sets of all time you might want to check out. Anyway, for some reason, they decided to design most of these creatures as if being legendary and multicolored was all upside. In reality, both of those things are actually downsides. Legendary cards are subject to the Legend rule. Of course, when they were designing Legends, and for the first few months after the set came out, the rule was different than it is today. When the set released, you could only play 1 copy of any legendary card in your deck. In other words, they were all restricted. So, yeah, even when they were designing this, they should have had that downside in mind. Obviously, being multicolored means they're harder to cast than a monocolored card. And then they printed a cycle of these multicolored vanilla legends that all have way below rate stats, even for the time. Jedit Ojanen being a hard to cast 7-mana 5/5 is a real head scratcher. It's definitely worse today than it was then, as creatures have gotten more efficient, but this rate was awful back in 1994 too. At number 7, it is Mishra's War Machine. Like Jedit Ojanen, this is a 7-mana 5/5, but it is an artifact, so it's easier to cast. It also has a text box, but it isn't all upside, at least not all the time. First, it has banding. That part is upside, as it allows you to determine how combat damage is done to creatures in combat. The other effect requires you to discard a card every upkeep. That's already a big downside, but it gets worse. If you can't discard, you have to tap it and it does 3 damage to you. That is a major downside, but I have it a little bit lower on this list than you might think because there are enough ways to get value out of a card that makes you discard every turn. Don't get me wrong, the card is still awful and there are far better discard outlets, but this being a repeatable discard outlet only makes it the 7th worst 7 mana card of all time. At number 6, it is Elder Spawn. This 7 mana 6/6 can't be blocked by red creatures. That's very narrow and unimpressive upside. It's a lot worse than Protection would be, and it comes with another major downside. You have to sacrifice an island every upkeep, or it does 6 damage to you, and you have to sacrifice it. That means this is going to very quickly consume your islands, and that just isn't worth it for a creature with below rate stats and a very weak color hosing effect. They really needed to give this some more significant upside against red if they wanted anyone to ever consider playing it. At number 5, it is Shrouded Serpent. I've talked about this card before in my top 10 on cards I thought were really good when I was a kid, but turns out they were bad. This was one of my favorite cards when I was a kid, so it does hurt a little to put on the list, but let's be real, the card is awful, no matter how cool the art is. This is a 7 mana 4/4, which we've already established is a terrible starting point for a creature. It does have upside in the text box, but it's just bad. Anytime it attacks, a defending player can pay 4 generic mana. If they don't, the Serpent is unblockable. So yeah, think about this. Let's imagine this was always an unblockable 7 mana 4/4. That would be a pretty bad card. This comes with an incredibly conditional form of unblockability, and the bad news for the Serpent is that when it isn't unblockable, it's likely to be one of the smaller creatures on the battlefield, which means it's going down. Even if they never pay for it, doing 4 damage at a time isn't even always a huge concern. This whole mechanic from Prophecy Block, where they had these your opponent can pay something or you get a good effect cards, was pretty much a failure, Rhystic Study notwithstanding, and this is another card that showcases just how bad it is to give your opponent the option of paying mana to shut down your upside. At number 4, it is Veldrain of Sengir. This 7 mana 5/5 comes with an activated ability that lets you pay 1 generic and 2 black to gain Forest Walk, and it also gets -3/-0 until end of turn. If this could just gain Forest Walk for that cost, it would still be a very bad card, so the fact it also shrinks to a 2/5 when you do it is just horrendous. Forest Walk is narrow enough. You don't need to make this hit for 3 less damage to balance it, especially because the card's starting rate isn't something you're interested in including in your deck anyway. At number 3, it is Karpluzan Giant. This has the worst stat line of any creature on the list, as it is a 7 mana 3/3. The good news is you can improve the Giant's stats, but the cost of doing it is massive. You can tap an untapped snow land to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So, sure, if you're playing a deck with all snow lands, and you probably should be if you're playing this, that does mean this can threaten to attack as a 9/9 on the next turn, but the cost of doing that is that you don't get to add to the board at all that turn, and this doesn't come with any built-in effect that makes it difficult to block. It can be chump blocked all day long. And it's also not difficult to remove, so you end up taking a massive tempo hit when you do what this card wants you to do, and that's a pretty good way to lose the game. At number 2, it is Searing Flesh. So far, all the cards in this list have been creatures, and that does mean that they actually add to the board in some way, even if they are all incredibly inefficient at doing it. Searing Flesh doesn't do that. It's a 7 mana sorcery that does 7 damage to an opponent. If we imagine that this could do 7 damage to any target, it still wouldn't be a good card, but it would at least have the option of functioning as removal and thus wouldn't be close to being on this list. Only being able to go after your opponent is just insane downside to have on a card this expensive. It can be exciting to do so much damage to your opponent all at once with one spell, but there are far more efficient burn spells out there that offer significantly more upside, like being able to target opposing creatures. And at number 1, I've included 2 cards that let you change your life total, Touch of the Eternal and Providence. These are similar to Searing Flesh in that they both cost a ton of mana, and they don't really do anything meaningful to impact the board or the game more broadly. Touch of the Eternal is definitely the worst of the 2. It's a 7 mana enchantment that makes your life total equal to the number of permanents you control during your upkeep. This means the turn you play it, it doesn't do anything, and then, on your next turn, you're going to hope you still have enough permanents in play for this to do something. It is extra problematic that your opponent knows it's in play, and thus they can think of the best way to make your life total go low. Sure, it has the upside of making your life total crazy high if you've gone super wide, but you should probably just win the game if this is making your life total that high. Since you have so many permanents, you should have a big advantage. Providence is really bad too, but not quite as bad as Touch of the Eternal. The effect it has before the game is kind of silly in Commander, since it would actually lower your life total to go to 26 in the format. I think if they redesigned this card today, they would say you start with 6 more life than your starting life total, but that's not what it says. But even in 60 card formats where you do start at 20 life, this effect isn't very good either. Setting your life total to 26 later in the game can be a nice effect, but just gaining a bunch of life isn't worth this much mana. Even if you do pull this off and gain like 25 life, the fact you spent your turn doing this means there's a good chance you're still going to lose when your opponent's turn comes around. You basically only delay the inevitable instead of actually dealing with the problem that got your life so low in the first place. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst 7-mana cards in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you want to create a cube of horrible Magic cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.